Okay, the event recording is on. So if you have any questions beyond today, or you know any coworkers that could benefit from this, or maybe you're standing in for somebody and you want to make sure that they get this information here today, this recording will be posted back up to community. Another important note of why we're also doing that is, especially in days like today, where we are walking through more conceptual concepts, sometimes we might be moving a little fast, and we want to provide you the opportunity to go back and review, especially in today's where you might find one section to be a particular pain point that you might be struggling with in your workflows today. You could go back to that section and review it. Okay. So my name is Joe Miller. Today you're here learning about how to make dynamic workflows. So really the target audience for this is people who have been building workflows to this point but want them to build more scalably. And we're going to talk about one of the big considerations that go into building those dynamic workflows here in a minute. But before we do so, I want to let everybody know this session will be around 45 minutes to an hour today. Everyone is muted by default on their entry of this room, but I am always open to hearing more questions throughout the session. So if there is a particular point in time or a particular point you want me to expound upon, go ahead and enter it into the Q&A window. And do note there are two ways to communicate with the presenter in this session. It is either via chat or Q&A. I do prefer the Q&A window just because I can see exactly who I've answered and who I've not at any given point in time. So it does highlight a little bit better when new items are coming in for me. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So what we're going to talk about today is upcoming trainings, and really there's not much to cover there because we are coming through the end of the year here, so we haven't scheduled out to 2019, but stay tuned. We will be coming out with that 2019 schedule sooner than later. We're going to walk through workflow backgrounds, and more importantly, we are going to define the problem that we're against, because the word dynamic can be a lot of things to a lot of people, and we want to really set the scope of what we mean by dynamic in this case. And then we're going to go in and do some designer training. Now, this designer training is quite different if you have been to any of our previous live trainings, mainly because this isn't a follow along, or we're not looking at one workflow. We're looking at little bottlenecks that you might be experiencing in your workflows. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open a workflow and present a problem and show you how to solve that problem, or an option to solve that problem. So that's what we're going to be working through today, and I'll address how I'm working through those workflows and what it's really representing, because some ways that we actually open these workflows can be confusing of what's being represented at any given point in time. So we'll address that when we get there. If you have any more questions beyond today's session, though, go to community.alteryx.com. You're already here for live training. If you haven't taken advantage of the wealth of content that is out there just beyond a lot of our training materials, go ahead and check it out. Sign in and geek out. That's kind of our fun phrase. But there are a lot of great knowledge-based articles that hit on a lot of these points, although they are a little bit more spread out than we have done in this training. We've tried to corral all the big points together to make sure people are enabled. Okay, so what is a dynamic workflow, and how are we defining it today? As a, not necessarily a joke, but just to keep it light, right? I say a dynamic workflow is kind of like Meryl Streep. You know, Meryl Streep, the one who won 3 Oscars, 170 other awards with 355 nominations, probably the most renowned actress of all time. Why are we talking about Meryl Streep in this conversation today? One, it might help you remember what dynamic workflows are. Two, it's because she's timeless, right? And I found this picture online. She hasn't seemed to have aged a day over the many 30 years that have elapsed between these pictures. But that's kind of like what we want for our workflows, right? We want to be able to stand the test of time without having to change our workflow through time. And I do add that variable of time as kind of the most critical factor that determines whether your workflow is going to be dynamic or not. So if you're out there building point solutions and workflows that only need to be built once and never run ever again, then you don't need to worry about being dynamic. If you have a workflow that you are running every week, whether it be manually or scheduled, then that becomes an issue, right? Like what has changed between last week and this week? Well, the first thing is time, right? But what happens with that time? And we're going to dig into that. It could be how the inputs are coming in. It could be how the schema of your data is. It could be how you're analyzing that data. A lot of it's going to be time-based. So we're going to cover a lot of time-based samples of how things change. So if we were to embody this into a workflow, the Meryl Streep of workflows, so to speak, here's an example of what we see in the wild all the time, right? So someone builds a workflow. It looks a lot like this, right? It looks great. Nothing really concerned about it. However, every time they have to run this workflow or as they discover new business rules and time elapses, right, the workflow starts to look like this, right? We can see a lot of issues. They're starting to add a lot more inputs. It seems like every month, 7/9, 7/10, 7/11, right? We can see every month they're changing it. We see a lot of this, right? Red highlighted comment boxes saying, hey, every time you run this workflow, be sure you turn these knobs on each of these configurations to make sure that the output is correct. So you can see that any highlights I have here is just like, this needs to change with every run. That's 150 days into production. That's really more or less defeating the purpose of having these automated workflows because you have to intervene every time. And that can be a little tedious to work with, right? So if we want to build the Meryl Streep of workflows, as it were, right, it'd look a lot like this. It would look the same as the day you ever put it into production, right? And if you built it in the correct way, we're confident that you can achieve this workflow nirvana, so to speak. So that's what we're talking about here today when it comes to building dynamic workflows. Now, how do I get to that point, right? And really, it's a few steps that we've identified, right? So a lot of people start in this red box, right? This red, circle. And there they say, let's build a workflow and solve the problem as it exists today, right? And that's could be very fitting if that's the only time you ever need to solve that problem. But if this problem has to be solved every day for the next 5 years, then you're in a different boat than a lot of people, right? You need to make your workflow scalable for time. So how do I do that? Well, you'll have to accommodate not only today's problems, but you'll have to make sure that there's a whole history of problems. Maybe the previous 5 years are accounted for, right? So that's kind of the next level. Some people might just take today's data and do analysis, but really they need to do a whole history of data, right? And that makes sense. That's pretty common too. And that's why I've kind of colored these two different colors. But really, when you're looking for dynamic workflows, you need to essentially map what's happened across history, right? What is the pattern that we see, and how do we see that pattern projecting into tomorrow, right? How is that problem going to change? If your schema adds a new field every week, right, that is an easy to project problem saying, hey, we have to accommodate changing schema because as soon as we fix it today, it's going to have to be fixed tomorrow, right? So being able to kind of see those differences between today and yesterday's problem will help you project tomorrow. And then the final step of that would actually to go in and resolve that. It is really helpful when building dynamic workflows to go in with a history of data to make sure that it's really worthwhile. If you're starting from the present day one of the whole process, you might have to revisit those workflows for maybe the first week or two. But once you start getting that cadence of what's going to change across time, you can kind of accommodate that in your workflow builds. So without further ado, right, it's pretty light on the concept side because I think a lot of us are probably on the same page of what a dynamic workflow would be. And I think I just wanted to set the scope to make sure that people understand it. So let's go in and just jump into a designer training and see what we mean about this, okay? So I'm going to minimize here, move some of my WebEx from Windows around. And the first thing I'm going to do is talk about how I'm going to present this to you, right? Because what I'm presenting is currently the present, right? I can't live in the past and the future all at once. However, I've tried to mock this up for you, right? So what I have in this workflow is I've created situations of this is how I've built it today, right? And I'm going to show you why it might break based on tomorrow. And then I have a version of the workflow that actually represents kind of the fixed updates, which is great. The other thing that I'll be doing through this session is I'll keep the same workflow, but I'll be pointing the workflow at different source data, right? So in this example, I might go in and update this to data that represents the past and data that represents the future. So I'll try to guide you throughout that, but really I'm just going to be remapping kind of the source of these workflows to mimic the change in time, right? So if you see me opening and closing a lot of files, don't worry, I'm just trying to pretend that a year has elapsed or a month has elapsed to make sure we can see how that workflow has changed along the way. So there are a few different ways that we need to consider our workflows when it comes to being dynamic. A lot of them are working with the inputs and outputs, right? There's a lot of different cases for that. So we're going to talk about inputs and outputs, but if we have time, I'm going to try to touch on schema changes, dynamic analysis, right? So some people might be going through their calculations wrong and it might not scale. Parsing is an excellent one as well. So we might try to visit those if we have time, right? But do note that I haven't distributed this to anyone. This is not available on the community, and it's intentionally so because we want to just identify those points that are bottlenecks, right? And so you can come back later and revisit those. So after this session, I will try to host a link where you can download a lot of these sample workflows along the way, where you can compare the past and the future, but that does require a little bit of a nuanced way to work between them so you can compare them. So it might even be difficult even once I share it for people to understand exactly what I've been doing here. So here's a problem that we see all the time, right? Probably the first time they built this workflow, it was week 0, right? And over time, each time they run this workflow, week 1, week 2, week 3, they're dragging in a new file. So, if I'm doing this the old way, right, and not willing to change my ways to be more dynamic, I'm going to go back here, input problem 1, past data, right? I might go in and add a new file, union that in, and run, right? That's a problem, right? That every time I get week 6, right, I'm going to have to come in and run it. It's not worth my while. I need to update this, right? There's got to be a better way. Well, there is, especially as it pertains to text-based files like CSVs. So what I'm going to do, for the sake of comparison, I'm just going to move this over here and say, I want to get all of these files. In fact, I want to get all of the files that live within my directory. So let me toggle back over here and show you the directory that we're working with, right? So here's our past and tomorrow, and this is why it's a little confusing to work with, right? In the past, I have data 0 through 5, right? But if I were to look at tomorrow, the way it looks like tomorrow, right, I'd have 0 through 6. So if I were to change each of these to point to that tomorrow folder or the future folder, it certainly wouldn't bring in 6. We'd have to drag in that file individually, and off we go, right? However, I can actually do some updates here to make it work. So let me go to File, Browse, and I'm just going to go to the future state and just choose one of these files, okay? Now, there is a functionality within this input data tool to host wildcard values. That is to say, I could go in and create some variant of that file or the naming of that file to match all files. So the two important ones to know, and I should just open a text file so you can see them right up front, is question mark and asterisk, right? This represents one character, and this represents many characters. So if I went in here and said week underscore 0 question mark, it's going to go and look into my directory and find any file with week underscore and then has one character at the end. Now, if I go look at that, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I'll have one character after the underscore. So when I do run this workflow, and I will hit a browse tool just so we can see this, I'm going to click on this tool, go to the messages, and you can see that this tool has now read in week 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so it does fit. However, maybe I'm not even thinking dynamically enough. That one tool was able to bring everything in all at once. But once I get to week 10, right, I'm going to have a file named week underscore 1 character, but also I'm going to 2 characters, right? So maybe I just want many characters. And if we do remember from that text file that I just showed you, that asterisk will bring in many characters. So if I were to go in and drop in a week, sorry, an asterisk, for example, now that will not only work for today's, but well into, a month from now, right, when week 10 starts to come around. So just for kicks and giggles, I can show you. I'm just going to copy and paste that, create a new file, week 10. I'll go back here and tweak it to the single character value just to show you why it won't work, question mark. So you can see it brought through 0 through 6. I'm going to toggle that back to many characters. And now you can see 10. Now, if you know you're only going to stay in the double digits, for example, I could have done 2 question marks, and that also would have worked. Now, again, this process being dynamic really only works for text files. For a lot of people, the problem might extend beyond that. It might be something like this. It might be the Excel example, right? So a lot of times we see an Excel file and there's a new tab that's added on a monthly or daily basis, right? So here you can see I've got a table called February 9th, 2018, February 12th, February 13th, February 14th, and all it is, it's really thin, right? This is a weird way of logging our data, but really it's just stock data, one row of stock data that's coming in on a daily basis, and whatever system it is, however it's giving it to us, it's essentially adding a new tab every day. So when I go in and try to add a file, or I want to read in today's stock data, I'm going to have to drag in another input data, map it to the new table that was just added, and of course that's going to be really quickly growing file, so that process will get slower and slower and slower throughout time. Well, I'm sure you're thinking there's got to be a better way, right? And that's what we're here for. We're going to make life a little bit easier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here, go to File. Let's map back out of this input problem and go to this Excel input problem. And I'm going to go to the stock data, right? And you can see here that I've got all of my days. I don't want to drag these in one by one, input by input, but rather I just want to bring them in all at once. What I'm going to do is do this little trick here. And this trick is called dynamically inputting an Excel sheet. And this works really well. There's some challenges if you're working with differing schemas, but in this case we know that the schema is the same every day that this file changes. So let's work with that on the assumption in this problem. So what I need to do is I essentially need 2 input tools, okay? And one of the input tools you may not be familiar with. So what this input tool does is really just generates a manifest of all the sheet names that exist, right? So it first reads the file in a way that it's not normally used. It reads the file to see all of the tables/sheets that exist there. Now we need to create another input tool to read through these sheets and say, hey, bring the sheet in. Now bring sheet 12 in. Now bring sheet 13, right? And read them all together and smash them into one block just like that union tool would do. So what would do that? Well, no surprise, it leads with a dynamic prefix on it, but it's called the dynamic input tool. Okay, and this can be a little daunting to get to at first, but you'll find that it's really quite easy. Okay, so what it's going to do is this dynamic input tool is going to take whatever data is spit out of this input data tool, aka the sheet names, and use that to kind of build multiple input queries back to that Excel sheet. So I'm going to first update the source template. Okay, and what the source template does is it's simply saying to our input tool, saying, I want it to match the schema, and if it does, if it matches the schema, import it. So if we have some random sheet inside of our Excel workbook that's overview, and it's not structured the same as the other sheets that we want to bring in, it will just ignore it, right? So that is what is required of this tool, is saying, hey, I want it to follow this particular schema. Knowing the file that we have right now, everything is on schema, so I could have chosen any particular table because it matches the rest, right? So that's the first step, is saying, hey, what's kind of the format that I want my input data to follow? What type of field names do I want on output? And then from here, I have to tell my input data tool, now that I've mapped out how I want it to read in, or what format I want it to read in, now I have to show how I want it to read in, right? So I want it to read off a list of data sources, right? And our data sources just came out of here, this file, right? These sheet names. This is our list of sources / sheets that we're going to use on this table. And this is the action, right? And most times you don't have to change this at all. But this one is called change file or table name. So each time there's a new value coming out of this tool, is it a change in the whole file path? Is it a change in just the table name or the sheet name? In this case, it's just a change in the sheet name, which is kind of synonymously used with table name. So after all that configuration, we're done, right? I can run that workflow, and if I were to click on this tool and look at the messages, you can see each of these sheets from my Excel file being read in one pull, and now it's all available. So I'm going to pause there because I moved pretty quickly, and to see if there's any questions coming through on the line. Okay. So let's jump over to the next problem, okay? And this next problem, there are some issues with this data. I'm going to preface that on the way up, but hopefully you get kind of the concept, right? So right now, we've been able to successfully just say, hey, give me everything from this directory, or give me everything from this file, right? But what if we want to be a little bit more choosy, right? Like I want some of the stuff from the directory, but not all of it, right? I want to pick and choose. So let's say, for example, I wanted to dynamically always bring in the latest file from a certain directory. What was the last file written to my directory? We see this all the time, right? People are always looking to see what the most updated version of that file is and then read it in, okay? So what's happening probably today is someone's going in and just running a workflow where they search for the latest file manually and run their workflow. There is a better way. And in fact, we actually use a lot of the same tools that we did in the previous one. However, what many people might not know is that we have this tool called the directory tool. Okay. Now, let me just do this really quickly. See if this will work before I commit too much into this. Okay, perfect. So what does the directory tool do? Well, in the previous example, in order for the dynamic tool to work, we provided a list of sheet names, right? But what if things aren't an Excel file and they aren't provided as sheets? How do we read these files in a different way? So in this case, I'm looking at a directory of files, and in this case, it's a list of CSVs, right? We've done that before where we've brought them all in, and what if I actually just want the latest, right? Or I want to sort on some logic. So here we've got a list of everything that lives in whatever directory I've specified. In this case, I just chose the parent data directory close to outside of my workflow. And this could be any directory, really, that you can specify. It could be a literal path. I could specify here at a very high level for these directory tools if I want them to end in CSV, right? I could update what I want the prefix to be. You'll recognize those characters of asterisk dot asterisk. And then you could choose if there's subdirectories within it, right, to include all the files that live in those directories below it. Now, what you'll see is really nice here because I could use a dynamic input tool and read all of these in. However, I don't want to, right? Maybe I want to read the biggest file, or what the last write time was, or maybe what the last access time was. Just for the sake of sortability, I see the creation time is not really enlightening because it's all the same. Let's just say the last write time. I want to find what file had the last write time to it. So what I'm going to do, and it's not undifferent like working with your files like any other data within your workflow, is that I'm going to find the last write time descending. We're going to run that, inspect our data. So 423 was my last write time here, and 216. And all I want is this first one. Really, week 9 is the last file that I need. So what I'm going to do is just grab a sample tool. drop it in here, select the first record. So you see we're actually working with these files like data, right? I'm sorting, sampling. I could be filtering, saying, hey, anything that has the word contains CSV as a value. There we go. So now I've created kind of my perfect list of things that I'd want to dynamically input. It could be 5 things, it could be 10 things, but I could actually use all of my workflow logic that I know for working with data with working with what files I want to bring in before they've been brought in, right? So in this case, I have this path saying this is the file that I want to bring in. So let's go ahead and use a dynamic input tool to do that as well. I'm going to drag that onto the canvas. I'm going to input a data source, a template here, just like we did for the Excel file. And I'll say, even though we're pulling in week 9, for example, I could just pull in week 10, for example, right? We're all happy. Week 0. This matches any template, so I'm not really concerned, even though it will be a different file eventually. I'm going to say read in the full path, right? This is what it's going to use to judge which files it should read in. I'm going to say per file path in this list, which is a really short list. It's a list of 1. Use that as the input logic for this input data tool. So let's go ahead and run that workflow. And now you'll see that this tool, dynamic input, simply brought in week 9 data, right? And I never had to specify what the last written tool was. I never said, hey, week 9 is the last written tool. I used the logic within the workflow to say, here's the directory, here's the data from most recent to least recent. Give me the first one and bring whatever that is in. So that's dynamic. Now, some of the things that I will not do today, but I will cue you into is if you're doing queries to a database, for example. So if you're connecting into a database, you can actually map in current dates and times, right? Like what happened in the last 7 days from today. You can jump a SQL query right into here and edit that and dynamically update those values within your where statements or wherever within your statement to make it work just for you. So there's a question out there. Just wanted to confirm that each row of data is added to the browse tool from the dynamic tool. So just to make sure that I'm understanding it the right way, the dynamic tool will read each row that is coming in from the input side, and it will output however many rows each of those files have together in one block. So if I had 2 files with 2 records apiece, we would expect 4 on the output. If it does not fit this template, aka if there was the overview CSV or just a one-off that didn't belong in that directory and it didn't match this format, it would not be brought in and union together as a part of that data set. Okay, so we're already a half hour into the session and we've only talked about inputs. So let's have a little bit more fun and talk about a few different other examples that we might experience on our way to making workflows dynamic. So the first of which I'm going to do is a data type problem. Let me drag this on here. So here's my workflow. This works great. I have customers file and I'm updating the data types to them to make sure that they're quite optimal and everything works really well, okay? Now, what if I change this file? I'm going to do that right now. Customers to new customers, right? So we have a new file coming in this week that I want to union in, and I'll run this workflow again. However, you're going to see that I'm going to get a little issue, right? The schema that I had set for the other file the data types that I had set for the other file actually might not work super well for this incoming file, right? So I need to be a little bit more dynamic around that. And this one is actually a pretty easy one for a lot of people to work with. There's really 2 options that you have. The first of which is when you're working with string data to set that size or allowable length to a gratuitous amount that you would not ever think that would be exceeded. If there are people who are pinching bits and bytes out of their workflows, that might not be an optimal solution. For a lot of people, though, it doesn't really slow down their workflow if they don't have millions on millions of records. But if you are a byte pincher, I'm going to go to something called an autofield tool. Drop that in here, and essentially what the autofield tool says is I'm going to evaluate all of these fields and assign a data type based on what I see there. So think of this as kind of like a form-fitting data type finder, right? So it's going to find the first name, what the longest is, last name, what the longest is, and it's really going to minimize the size of those data types down to the longest existing one, right? Based on your logic, that might not be a good fit for you. However, that is an option here. And the great thing is, if it changed tomorrow, this autofield tool reanalyzes that whole data set every time the workflow has been run, right? It is a little bit more expensive when it comes into the workflow, but probably for a lot of people, not enough for them to notice. There are some cautionary tales that I'll have along the way, and some of it is things like zip code, where you might not want them to be a numeric type. They do get turned to a numeric type because the autofield says, hey, I see only numbers in this column, so maybe that should be an int 32. If you're concerned about that, I could simply deselect the fields that I don't want to be considered on a recurring basis as well. So that is the autofield tool that will kind of circumnavigate a lot of those field type problems that you might have that lead to truncation of values or having those data types just kind of inexplicably change. Okay, time for some schema changes. So let me open a workflow here, and let's just take a peek at a common use case that people might come across. So here I have a simple workflow, sales by month. Here I have first, last name, gender, email, kind of a standard data set, right? And if I go over to my select tool, I'll see that I want January spend, Feb, March, April. That's great. I do know that this workflow does change every single month, right? So when it comes into next month, I'll probably get a new field that's called May spend, right? Now, if I were to actually go jump to that May spending file, go to the future state, where there will be May spending as a part of that data file, and I run that, I can peruse through my data and I say, well, that's odd. There is no May spend. Let me go back and look what happened to my select tool. Oh, it is there. It's just been deselected by default. Now I could click it and run it, and it's back in the workflow. But you'll see that the issue here, right, is that it wasn't dynamic. It didn't auto-detect that that May spend was here. Well, for those of you who are kind of in that position, you may have a problem being solved by this little field here that you might not know you had a problem for, right? So this unknown field, right? What this unknown field says, and let me reconnect this workflow to reset to our past state. What this unknown field really does when you select it or deselect it says, hey, if something changes in the future, aka if a field is added, like May spend, do I want it to be auto-selected or auto-deselected, right? By deselecting unknown, I've auto-deselected that field. Now, if I were to just select unknown and now bring in that future month data, I'll run that workflow. Now, if I pan all the way over, May spend is a part of that data set, and that unknown May spend was selected by default, right? So that's a really great thing, and you'll see even as something as simple as that auto field we just visited, that dynamic field was here. Essentially, anytime you see that selection, that tool is a really great candidate for any dynamic workflows because it will update or not update based on your needs, right? And that's a really important fact or point that I want to point out is that dynamic is not always better. Maybe you don't want to include certain things all the time, right? So being as stringent or lax as you need is a spectrum, and determining where you should sit on the spectrum with your data is entirely up to you. Now, let's go to just a little bit more of a nuanced case that we see people come against. All right. Here's a workflow. And it looks like what this particular person wants on a monthly basis is all of the information around uh, first, last name, gender, all the demographic information. However, they don't want certain fields going forward, right? They don't want January spend, Feb, March, April spend. They just want the travel fields, okay? Now, this is a little bit of a pickle, right? Because if I select unknown, it's going to presumably in May, it's going to bring in the fields May spend and May travel. If I deselect it, it won't bring in either. So here's my recommendation, and here's how you'll be successful, is keep that unknown field selected, okay? So let's go ahead and change that future file and see that May field come in, and then talk about how we're going to work through that problem. Okay, let's look at the data. I see May spend and travel in there. So when we run it and pan all the way over, May spend, May travel is there. Okay, so they both came in. But really, when we look at the output of this tool, we just want the travel information, right? So how am I going to circumnavigate this? So there's a tool in here called, with a nice prefix, dynamic select. Okay, so there's a certain rule that we have, right, that says, hey, anytime there's, let me get back to my data, there's travel or spend, right? Like we just don't want anything with the word spend in there, right? Um, so let's go in and select things. Now, by default, this dynamic select, what it's going to do is select things based on data type. So if I wanted to say just output everything that was an integer, I could. But what's more popular here is dynamically selecting on a formula. So what we want is something as simple as does not contain, right? And we'll add the field. Then the field name cannot contain spend. So now what it's done is it's basically deselected anything with the word spend in its name from the data set. Now you could do something as simple as, right, like you'll see different options like only select things from this particular source or file, or the one that I like is type or field number. That's really popular, right? People say keep the fields 1 through 10, and then for everything else, see if it has spend or not. So there's a lot of options that you can do with that dynamic select. So my default is to kind of let everything through and then prune it down dynamically with this select tool. So I'm going to pause there. I do see some questions coming in, so let me just read them off right now. Now that you're talking about output, can we talk about how to create a single spreadsheet with multiple tabs as an output? We will get there. Just hang in there. I'm not quite to that spot yet, but we will show you. Does it matter the order of the unknown feature? It does and it doesn't, right? So if you move the unknown around, and let's say, I didn't have May and spend come into this data set yet, what's going to happen is when I open that new file, May and the May spend and travel would have appeared in this data set right after, I guess, county or country, right? So it would have been adding the fields here. Which could mess up things if you're working with something positionally. But typically, since they're later in time, a lot of people like the order of how they are in the data set. If you're doing certainly most recent to least recent, then I would keep unknown at top, move May right below it, March right below May, so on and so forth. So it will put things inside the data set where that unknown is. So how to select the first tab in an Excel name regardless of the name of that tab? So that's a great question. And it would actually be no different than what we did here, okay? Except it would be an Excel file. So let me go back to that Excel file example very quickly, if I can find it. So here we have all the sheet names from this file, and you just want the first one, no matter where it is in the data set. I'm just going to go to sample, get the first row, and run that data set. And now instead of bringing in all those sheets, it would have brought in just that first sheet. So is there a dynamic function to clean up field names all in one shot? There's a large file with 50 plus fields, and they all start with a prefix that I want to remove. There absolutely is. I actually didn't have this built in as part of the presentation, but we can certainly do it right now because it's so ridiculously easy. And I'm trying to see if they've got anything with a, let's just say for the sake of doing this example, I want to remove the travel suffix off of all of my data. Okay, so what I would use is a dynamic rename. With my data, and I would do a formula, and it could be on all of the fields or a certain selection of fields. So I could say, hey, do it on, since only travel and spend fields are happening coming forward, I could just choose those fields to do it. But you'll see beyond formula of manipulating them, I could simply say remove a prefix or suffix, right? So remove travel as a suffix, give it a run. All the travels are gone, right? If you wanted to vary that logic to be more conditional, if it starts with this, remove this prefix. That if it starts with that, do that prefix. You'll want to be in this formula field. What also you could do that's really helpful is if you have a pristine, this is the source of the truth, this is what they all should be named, here's a file of all that meta info, you can actually pipe in that meta info from the right input and use that to update all of the field names within that file. So a lot of good options. This is a really powerful tool that will make your life easier. And a bonus one, right? If you're in a point solution and you just want to remove spend or travel, I could choose which fields I want to remove a prefix or suffix from. I could go to options. Well, in this case, it's add, but I could just add a suffix or prefix. If I had them renamed, I could do it. Let me see here. Remove suffix. Just the L, EL, VEL, right? I'll just remove travel, and it renames them right there in the select. So quick way of working with that data as well. All right, that's fast and furious, but it's fun. So let's go ahead and open the next example. We've worked with input schemas. Now, let's see what we have next. The next we have an analysis problem. These get fun. And this is actually where you might find some of your biggest payoffs in being dynamic, because a lot of them, once you set up inputs and outputs, it's quite easy. But analysis can take a little bit more effort to wrap your mind around. So here I have an example of kind of an undynamic way of someone doing a calculation. So we have this data set of monthly sales, and you've probably seen something like this in your life, right? Each column is a month all together, and what they're doing after each month is they're creating a formula that calculates the total sales. So when I run this, if I panned all the way to the end of my data set, I have total sales added into my data set. Okay, and they also might be doing something like adding all of the columns together vertically to create a total sales view as a column, and then total sales as kind of a row at the bottom, right? Now, the issue here is if I were to change my data to tomorrow's, and I run that workflow again, I've now added December data to my data set because it's a month later. But the issue is that my totals being calculated via this formula tool do not include December. So what most analysts will do is they'll come in here, punch in December, and it's good to go. Now, that's not a very dynamic solution because every month that comes in, I'll have to come in and basically update that formula to make sure everything works nicely. I'm going to show you a different way around the solution that doesn't require you touching this every single month. So let's go back to monthly sales here. And what I'm going to do is essentially pivot this data set, okay? And there's a whole training around pivoting data sets. So if you do find yourself getting really confused on this and you haven't used these before, don't worry. There's some lessons out there on Alteryx Academy that will help you out, okay? Now, the rule of thumb that I find to be the best, right, is anytime I don't have to specify column names as a part of a calculation, the better I'm going to be, right? So in this case, every month that I'm coming in, I'm specifying a new column name, and that can be kind of uh, difficult and lethargic and tedious. I'm way better off calculating things vertically, right? Because vertically, I actually don't specify, especially in these transpose options, I don't really specify field names. And you'll see what I mean here in a minute. So what I'm going to say is transpose this data. So all of my months are actually sandwiched into one single column, right? So I have each store name that I've kept untransposed here, and each month that store has been together, right? And I want to calculate the total across all of these months for creatures great and small. I want to create a separate total for all of the animal house months, a separate total for all of the aquatic critters, so on and so forth. So I'm going to do something that you could do this a couple different ways, right? I could do this via a summarize. I could say for each store, give me what we call the value, right? The sum of that value. And I would have calculated the total for each of those stores. And then what I also could have done to get that back in is done a join on the data set saying name is equal to name. And now each store has kind of their sum value added to the end. That's one way, but there's actually, and that is dynamic, that is a valid way to get to your solution. But a lot of people don't know this, and this is kind of a fun fact, is the crosstab back into the original data shape will actually recalculate that data for you. So if I said, hey, I want to crosstab this back, don't pivot name back into any position because we never pivoted it in the first place. The column names are January through December and the values that belong with them. For each of these values, when we pivot them back, what do we want to do? Maybe we want to add a total column, add a total row, right? I'll run that. So now you can see that my total row has updated for everything in that row, and I also have a total row corresponding with that. So more often than not, my recommendation is run your calculations downward. So if your calculations are currently going horizontal, pivot it so they're all going downward, and then once you've done your calculation, pivot them back into the original state. And you'll see that what's really exciting about these, right, is that button that we are always hunting for, that dynamic or unknown workflows. That'll make sure that anything that comes in, if January 1st, 2019 came in, it would now be selected and a part of that pivot. And of course, it would all fall into the value field for pivoting back. So that one's tough, right? And might actually need some rewatching a few times if you want to come back and revisit this. But that's going to be a really quick way to get to your answer. And you can actually see it's, in terms of just one-time development, it's even faster, just running these two pivots back and forth. So some pretty cool stuff. Now, I've got 9 minutes left, so I'm just going to show an output problem. Okay, and here's my problem, right? Now that we have this data updating every month, I have people coming in and saying, hey, here's my sales by month. I want to select, just the January information, send that out for January customers. Just the February, send that to February customers. Just the March, right? So on and so forth. But really, that's not going to work for us in the long run. We need a better solution because every month I'm going to come in and create a new output. Okay. So let's go ahead and show an example of that. If I can get this to play nicely. Let me just drag this in for the sake of time. Okay. So here's the way someone has gotten around doing that, right? So they have the sales by month. Everything's the same as usual. I got Feb, Jan, March, April, May. And of course, in the way of dynamic life, they've transposed it. So now this information, if I were to run this, is running downward, right? I've got information on this particular female through December through May, right? One of my customers, this customer, December through May. And I want to still output these into files that are just December, just January, just February, right? So here, There's just some cleanup going on. They're just renaming that value field to spend just to be really transparent. Next, they're actually creating what they call a file name, right? So they're using a formula saying, hey, using this data, aka really working with this name and parsing out what that month name is, just create a file name that I would want this to be a file part of. So every February spend has a Feb uh, uh, customer sales file association with it. And then in the output tool, and this is probably the most important part, is I choose the location that I want to save it to. So in this case, I'm going to choose my desktop and name it whatever you want it to be, right? In this case, I know that this file name is going to change for every file name value I have in this field. So I just name it something kind of nonsensical. What's really important is I choose what file type it is. In this case, CSV, right? And then from there, I'm going to say, hey, I want to output this new file for every time there's a different file name, right? So if I have 50 states in my data set, I'm going to have 50 different files, and it is going to be the unique value, right? So in this case, there's 3 Arizonas. What this is going to do is just find one Arizona file and put all of the Arizona-related rows as a part of that file. So when I do run this workflow, foo.csv, I'm going to click on these messages. You can see that I have created an April, December, Feb, Jan, March, May customer data set. And even if I went so far as to crack those open, which it is doing on my other screen, you will see that it is everybody that was a part of that May spending group. So it has dynamically parsed those out. Now, this can easily be toggled over into Excel, for example. So let me just create this spend workbook into XLSX. I'm going to save that. And I'm just going to keep sheet 1 as a default, right? And instead of saying I want multiple files with each month, I'm going to say each month should be its own tab, right? So in this case, for each sheet 1, I'm going to say change that file or table name, aka the sheet name, to be whatever that file name I specified. I'll run that workflow. You can see the same file, spend XLSX, has been built, but different tabs within that file has been built. So I'm going to crack that open so we all can get a peek at that. And you can see I've got my one Excel sheet, April, December, Feb, Jan, March, right? All that data is right there in one place. So that is dynamically outputting into multiple sheets within one Excel file. There's a lot going on there. I know there's a lot of information. Hopefully, though, it was just to get you acquainted. You could actually see some use cases live. You could actually identify what you want to pursue. And if you do, all of this information is out there on community. I did build it real time for most of these examples here, so you will see an example of them in use. Now, I'm going to pause there and see if there's any questions. And I'm also just kind of curious, do you guys think we hit the mark? Do you think this is the right way to solve some of your problems that you're having today in terms of dynamic workflows? Yeah, there is a question saying, has the session been recorded? Yes, it has. It is being recorded. We will post it up after this session. Alrighty. Let's close this out. If you do need any more help, right, what are your assets that you have? Alteryx community, we can't hammer it home enough. There are people that are actually quite competitive about solving problems. So if you're someone coming with a challenge, people are more than willing to solve that. And typically it's with the more benign, easy problems, problems like these, I think a lot of people are familiar enough with them. You might see solves within half hour or an hour if you just post it up there. Now, if there's any tools that you're looking more into, like the pivot, for example, we do have those on Alteryx Academy where we have interactive lessons. Same with bringing in multiple Excel sheets at once. There are trainings around that. If you do experience any unexpected problems, though, go ahead and check out our technical support. Hit them up at support@alteryx.com, and they'll get you on your way. That's it. My name's Joe Miller. I really appreciate you joining today. I want to wish everybody a happy holidays and a happy new year. This is the last we'll be running it, but keep your eyes set on that live training page. We will be making updates to them, hopefully in the next week or so. So thank you everybody for joining, and we'll see you next week.